Good morning. Good morning, folks. I know we may still have some folks join us, but I will start us off with a little intro and housekeeping for our webinar by the Southern Alliance for Clean Energy this morning. This morning, we are going to hear from Shelley Robbins, who is our Senior Decarbonization Manager, about the connection between Southeast electricity, excuse me, Southeast electricity bills and the build out going on right now of the gas pipeline system and LNG exports. And then we are lucky to be joined by our special guest during this webinar. Megan Gibson is a senior attorney with the Southern Environmental Law Center, or SELC, with extensive background in gas and LNG exports in particular. So that's going to be our run of show. But first, I will kick it over to our executive director, Steve Smith, to give a little intro. As we are going, feel free to put questions in the Q&A box. We have saved time for those at the end. Thanks. Over to you, Steve.
Great. Thank you, Maggie. And good morning, everybody. And thanks for joining this very important webinar where we're going to be sharing some new information and research that we think has some pretty profound implications for our region. Um, I'm Stephen Smith, the Executive Director of the Southern Alliance for Clean Energy, and SACE is a regional energy policy and environmental advocacy organization that works throughout the Southeast that promotes responsible, equitable, and energy choices to ensure clean, safe, and healthy communities throughout our region. Let's pop to the next slide. You know, I, I, some of you have heard our webinars before, have heard me say this, that we're living sort of both in the best of worst times. Um, you know, on the good side, we're seeing the technologies being deployed that can actually solve the climate crisis, that can address a lot of the impacts. We're seeing uh, huge flows of money into the clean energy space, and we're seeing the technologies being deployed. But we also are feeling enormous pressure from climate disruption and just the devastating effects that we're seeing in flooding, wildfires, extreme weather events, just sort of roller coaster of the disruption in the climate. And so we've got to hold both of those simultaneously. Today's webinar really gets into a key piece of how energy markets work and how energy is produced and consumed in our region. And one of the key things is in this space is uncertainty and risk. And we are certainly in a period of great uncertainty, and there are a lot of risk. There are agents in the energy space who will attempt in this time to socialize that risk and privatize the profits. In my 30 plus years of being involved in this space, I've never really seen anything like what we've seen in the last few years, where we've effectively gone from flat load growth, meaning that there's not a lot of growth in the electric uh, markets in our region, to basically hyperbolic hyperscaling, largely driven by digital demand in the form of cloud, storage, AI, and crypto server farms. And this hyperbolic hyperscaling should be raising red flags about speculative plays in this market and who wears the risk, who is ultimately potentially bearing the most risk in these uncertain times. And so today we're going to talk about the fossil methane gas industry and how it appears that they're gaming this period of uncertainty uh, at regional electric utility bill payers' expense. And there's a lot of really valuable information that'll come out. And ultimately, what we're looking at is the gas industry potentially setting up a play more for export and a lot of us subsidizing that export market through our electric bills. And what is the role of for the utilities? What is the role for regulators in this speculative infrastructure? And how does that play forward? It's complicated. There's been some really good research to tease a lot of this apart. So I hope that you'll find it useful that way. But we also need to keep there's risk associated, financial risk associated with ratepayers where people's bills are potentially going up. But the other thing that we can't lose sight on is this is a phenomenally large carbon play where you have methane, fossil gas that is being extracted and potentially burned at scales at very large volumes. And we're talking more than 500 million decatherms of fossil gas. To put that in context, it's roughly over 100 million metric tons annually of carbon emissions, which is effectively about 1/6 of the total amount of the whole U.S. gas infrastructure. This is just in our region and where it's going. And so it has a serious implication both on cost on consumers and on impacts to the natural environment. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Shelley Robbins, who's done an extensive amount of work here, and let her take you deep into this speculative play that we're trying to put some sunshine on. Shelley?
Thank you, Steve, and thank you, Maggie. Um, I'll go through the sections of the paper. It was a pretty dense paper, and you can see the sections here before turning it over to Megan Gibson at the Southern Environmental Law Center. So next slide, let's jump in. All right, this map is not in the paper, but I wanted to include it for folks who are less familiar with our fossil gas basins outside of Alaska. It's from the U.S. Geological Survey. It's a slightly outdated, but it helps convey the size and location of the basins. The Appalachian Basin, stuck way up there away from the LNG ports in the Gulf, is on par with the Permian and the Gulf. In the Permian, gas is usually found with liquids, with oil, due to its chemical composition, it doesn't lend itself to LNG. So the major player is the Gulf. But there are estimates that the Haynesville area, for example, may have only 10 to 15 years left. The science and technology, they're still moving on that issue. But that could be a future factor in Appalachian export. Next slide. So just putting a pin in that. We won't go into more of that here, but just making a note of it. All right, these figures are in the paper. But to summarize, we have 5 major pipeline expansion projects at FERC right now. And Transco Southeast Supply Enhancement Project and MVP Southgate are out of the Appalachian Basin. And running east of the Blue Ridge, we're going to kind of focus on that area. And I focus on that in the paper. And these 5 projects, which have firm transportation contracts with our Southeastern utilities, total 5.5 million decatherms per day. And as Steve said, it was 1/6 of the CO2 emissions of the entire U.S. gas fleet in 2022. I'm going to generally speak in terms of decatherms. Sometimes it's going to be billion cubic feet, but in order to sort of keep things consistent, because it can be hard to go back and forth, I'm going to pretty much stick with using the same term, decatherms per day. So if anything is stated in cubic feet, I will translate that into decatherms, and we'll just kind of keep it apples to apples in that way. So it's the power equivalent, this 5.5 million decatherms per day. If we want to convert that into what it might look like in power plant burn, it's the equivalent of almost 32 gigawatts of combined cycle plants running full blast 24/7, 365, which they don't actually do. And to compare, Duke Energy's existing coal and gas fleet has a total capacity of just over 21 gigawatts. So we're talking, a Duke and a half, essentially, adding with just these 5 projects. So if nothing else, I want folks to internalize the size of this gas build out. And that doesn't mean it's all going to combined cycles. It's just, I'm just sort of creating a sort of an image for you to be able to visualize what this amount of gas means. But also coming soon to a FERC filing near you are two more projects. One's called, I've heard it Kosi and Koshi Junction project, which is likely to file in this quarter. And it's another 1.58 million decatherms per day. And it would connect from Haynesville, Utica, Marcellus, and Fayetteville basins to markets in the Southeast United States that are tied into Gulf South's existing system. And then there's also Energy Transfer South Mississippi project, which is a 1 to 2 million decatherm per day project designed to increase gas supply and deliverability to the Southeast market as well. So that's like adding another 20.6 gigawatts of CC power, or another Duke, for a total of 52 gigawatts of combined cycle. If all this went to CC burn 24/7, 365, it would be 52 gigawatts. Now, just a note, Grid Strategies sees only 13 gigawatts of data center load, load growth through 2029 in Georgia. So that's where most of that would happen. Wood Mackenzie forecasts, I think, 23 gigawatts of data center load nationally. And so we're signing precedent agreements here in the Southeast to add the equivalent of twice the Wood Mackenzie national data center load. Next slide. So let's focus in on one utility, and I chose Duke Energy because of its location at essentially the Southeast Pipeline Firm Transportation Gateway, and because they have signed agreements for about 20% of this gas. And because we have just been through an extensive IRP proceeding, there's a lot of testimony and there's a solid record. So Duke has a stated goal of procuring firm transportation from its entire CC fleet, not its peakers, but its big combined cycles. And you see that on the left. And on the right is their existing and contracted firm transportation rights. So here we see Duke's maximum needs for the existing CC fleet is 980,000 decatherms per day, and then the proposed 3 new CCs that were essentially approved in the latest IRP require a maximum of 705,000 decatherms per day. These firm transportation purchases serve the 3 proposed new plants while also firming up supply to the rest of the existing CC fleet. So this gas is for peak burn, 24/7, 365. How often does that happen? And what happens to the unused capacity? Well, it goes to Duke's own CTs first, their peakers, and then it goes to the third-party market if they don't need it. But, I mean, is it really needed? So the other thing to consider is that the cost for all of this firm transportation, whether it's needed or not, the cost for these contracts is passed through the fuel dockets and the rate cases to us. Next slide. But at the same time, there is testimony in the IRP that shows that the amount that all these CCs are going to actually run drops pretty precipitously. This is the projected combined cycle generation in what is called Duke's P3 fall supplemental, which is the one that does include their estimation of significant load growth in the latest IRP for those who are following that. And you see it begins to decline almost immediately. So on the vertical axis, we see combined cycle generation in gigawatt hours on the left, and on the right, we see all 5. Duke would like to build 5. They've got approval for 3, but all 5 of Duke's proposed combined cycles and the potential generation of each of them. And that's assuming about an 81% capacity factor, or generally speaking, running about 81% of the time. That's an oversimplification, but generally speaking. And then the horizontal lines represent a 35-year book life. So as you see, those horizontal lines shift for, they're in different locations for each of the CCs. And then CC generation is what the models have shown is quickly replaced by carbon-free resources as soon as they become available. And that is because they are cheaper. As the Maria Rampani, who prepared this graph, pointed out in her testimony, the CCs serve a transient need. So if firm gas contracts are for 20 years, but the need for the combined cycle fleet drops dramatically, almost immediately, for the existing CCs, and in 10 years for the new CCs, then where can Duke resell that pipeline capacity and the molecules that move through that capacity? Next slide. They sell it in the capacity release market. And from there, those molecules have a pretty easy path to LNG export terminals. These are existing, this is from the EIA data, and these are existing and under construction LNG export terminals, including Kinder Morgan's Elba Island near Savannah, Georgia, and then those clustered in the Gulf of Mexico. Now, make a note of the blue item labeled Cameron in Louisiana. And we're going to talk about that one a bit more. So Cameron is right up there, kind of in the middle, above Calcasieu Pass. Next slide. So this map is not in the paper, so this is special for webinar attendees. But there will be a link to its location when you get the slides. It shows the Cameron Interstate Pipeline, and I do talk about that pipeline in the paper, just not with this map. The beauty of the map is that you can see the physical connection. The pipelines, generally speaking, in the Gulf of Mexico are kind of a spaghetti monster. And this map kind of clears away many of the other projects so we can see what's going on here very clearly. There are 7 pipelines that supply the Cameron Interstate Pipeline, which connects down to the Cameron LNG facility. And Transco is one of those pipelines. You can kind of see the connecting pipelines as they string across at the top. They're sort of light gray lines, but you can see Transco in there. And then that connects at Transco's compressor station 45. And as you can see on the right, those are the numbers on the right are receipt points on the pipeline for February 9, 2025 for delivery to Cameron LNG. And you can see where it's being supplied, and you can see that Transco is supplying nothing. That may be because Transco's available capacity is locked up pretty tightly right now. But that will not be the case if all of these projects are built out. So why export? What is the incentive? Next slide. Money, of course, and profits. So we can see in this table, it's really tiny here. It is in the report, but you can see this was prepared by Natural Gas Intelligence. The average net back over the past year, which is essentially profit. Net back is simplified what you can sell it for minus what it costs to acquire and ship. So the net back out of the Gulf was $9.0.328 per decatherm, compared to the Henry Hub average of $4.17. That's an average. It varied by month, but that's an average over the year. That is a pretty good incentive to increase the ability to send more gas to Gulf terminals. That is where the money is. But this is sort of an image. So so that highway, which is Transco, and several other pipelines as well, is pretty much a parking lot right now. It is completely booked. This is what Transco looks like from north to south. There is no room for more firm capacity of gas molecules. It's the same situation in the Gulf, despite the spaghetti monster of pipelines. There still aren't quite enough pipelines to take gas away from the wells and to the ports, especially as more ports are added. And the load in the Southeast might materialize fully, or it might not. But the customers of Duke Energy, Dominion, Santee Cooper, and Georgia Power are going to pay to add north to south capacity, whether it's needed or not. It is my assumption, I cannot speak for them, that Transco would like to be able to send more than zero gas to the Cameron Interstate Pipeline and Cameron LNG. Next slide. This chart, tiny, is not in the paper itself, but it is in the Department of Energy paper that was released in December that looks at U.S. LNG exports. Oh, I'm sorry, we need the next slide, please. Yeah, there we go. Yeah, this is the chart, tiny. So I highlighted some of the takeaways on the right. This is from the DOE's LNG paper. That is linked in the paper, so you can find the full thing. But essentially, we have 14.28 billion cubic feet per day of LNG operating, 14.28 million decatherms, and 42.14 billion per day authorized. So that's, and then there's more in the pipeline, so to speak, after that. And 1 billion cubic feet of gas provides 1 million decatherms of energy. So as the Haynesville Basin is depleted, as the grid and industry decarbonize and don't need the molecules, as foreign markets are willing to pay a premium for LNG, Appalachian Basin gas will be drawn down south to export, and we will have paid for that. Next slide. So what are the pipeline companies themselves saying about the opportunity to add more pipeline capacity in the Southeast, paid for by ratepayers? So this was from EQT. This was from a call, I believe this is in the paper. But note that they say that's why the utilities are willing to pay the prices that they did to lock up reliable gas supply. And what prices did they pay? That is something that we don't know. Those precedent agreements are typically locked up pretty tight, considered confidential. But I've read in numerous places the opinion that Southeastern utilities, while I've heard them say in proceedings that they got a good deal, that they're actually paying quite a bit for capacity on these pipelines. And then not in the paper, but something I found recently from Energy Transfer Partners from their 10K. In February, they said, and I quote, "If we do not continue to construct new pipelines, our future growth could be limited. Our results of operations and ability to grow and to increase distributable cash flow per unit will depend in part on our ability to construct pipelines that are accretive to our distributable cash flow." So they make money by building things just like utilities do. And interestingly, as far back as 2014, Williams envisioned a project that would connect Western Marcellus Shale to the Gulf area. And it was called the Western Marcellus Pipeline Project. And in many ways, the MVP and Transco's fragmented expansion projects via the MVP as a sort of a header for that Marcellus gas, and then the looping and compression upgrades is essentially that same project finally coming to fruition. I don't think they envisioned the growth in LNG in 2014, and the utilities did not have the growth needed to make that project pencil. It was never filed at FERC, but here we are now. Next slide. So this is the crux of it all. The electric companies pay the pipeline companies. Electric companies make money building infrastructure. Pipeline companies make money building infrastructure. All those costs get passed on to us, the ratepayers. The utilities, they do operate under jurisdiction of regulators, which is partly why I'm trying to daylight this issue and make regulators aware of the potential here, the potential to lock us in to high bills for something that we're not getting use out of. But ultimately, the pipeline companies themselves, they can't lose in this. So there have also been a number of studies, and this is discussed in the paper, but I won't go into it in great depth here, showing that increasing LNG exports from the US will increase the price of gas for us here at home. So we pay for the infrastructure that we will quickly not need anymore. And as a thank you, we get higher gas prices. And we get increasing climate catastrophes that cost us all billions. So on that very cheerful note, I'm going to turn it over to Megan Gibson with the Southern Environmental Law Center. Thank you.
Thank you, Shelley and SACE. And hello, everyone. Megan Gibson, Senior Attorney with the Southern Environmental Law Center. I'm honored to be here with you today having this important conversation. Next slide, please. So I'm going to take us a step back a bit here and take a moment to explain the federal law that governs interstate gas and LNG export approvals, as it's relevant to answering the questions of why and how this massive gas expansion is facilitated at the federal level as well as the state level in our region. And then I'll touch upon a central issue that many on this call are familiar with, namely regulatory capture. So there is a statutory divide between FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, and the Department of Energy, DOE, of duties and authorities under the Natural Gas Act that reporters, lawyers, analysts, and even sometimes regulators themselves still get confused by, but I'm really going to try here to simplify it as much as possible, as it's important foundationally to understand this. So under the Natural Gas Act, Section 3 authority for the import and export of liquefied natural gas, the Department of Energy has primary responsibility for determining whether or not the import or export of gas is in the public interest. FERC decides whether the location, the siting, construction, and operation of the terminal is also consistent with the public interest. So in other words, if you take anything away from that, DOE decides on the commodity export of the gas itself, whether or not Company A can export gas to China, for example. And FERC decides on the facility, on the infrastructure. And to make it a bit more even complicated, later on top of that, FERC has authority on how the gas gets to the LNG facility. Namely, it has Section 7 authority over interstate pipelines. And that authority over the pipelines carries a higher threshold on its face legally, as FERC's job is supposed to determine really whether or not a project is in the public interest. And that includes granting the extraordinary power of eminent domain to take land to build these projects to pipeline developers. And just to note in contrast, there is no eminent domain authority conferred for the LNG export terminals themselves. They have to buy that land outright. So why does this matter? Because approval of these facilities and of export of the gas really should turn upon a public interest or public necessity standard. Yet FERC and DOE have almost never found a proposed project not to be in the public interest. And the jurisdictional split is also led to a passing of the buck of who is really supposed to be looking under the hood at these projects, rolling up their sleeves as regulators and doing the analysis to make sure that there is a true and accurate public interest determination. So at the end of the day, no one really is weighing or truly examining these projects' economics, greenhouse gas emissions, broader societal costs, potential adverse impacts on our domestic economy, and has led, in former FERC Commissioner Clement's words, for FERC to, quote, have no clear standard for making public interest determinations for LNG facilities. So, in short, FERC is rubber stamping these massive projects without a robust legal framework to guide its decisions. Just to add to it, a former chair, FERC, Richard Glick, expressed a similar concern, and he pointed out that they don't have a meaningful framework for evaluating whether an LNG facility's adverse impacts might be so severe that the commission should say no. And so, as a consequence, even though FERC has this authority to reject a terminal based on all of the considerations that I just tried to touch upon, in practice, it never does. So next slide, please. You can imagine this is translated into near automatic approvals for LNG gas export infrastructure. The Commission has approved over 9% of gas infrastructure. They've reported that number to Congress, proposals before it. And related to that, at least to my knowledge, DOE has never denied a request to export LNG. So as a result, in under a decade, in combination with fracking, the U.S. is catapulted from a minor LNG exporter player to the world's largest exporter of methane gas. So to understand better why this is all so urgent, I just want to highlight again, and Shelley touched on this a bit, but just the bigger picture of LNG exports. So by February 2024, right before the Department of Energy's incredibly narrow, I want to emphasize that, and temporary pause on approvals of export of gas to non-fair trade agreement countries, really DOE finally decided to give this all a little think. The nation's operational LNG export capacity topped 14 billion cubic feet per day. And what's even more striking is that between DOE and FERC, they've authorized anywhere between 43 to 48 BCF per day, billion cubic feet per day of LNG exports. And if all of this infrastructure were built and operational tomorrow of the gas that's already been approved, our export capacity would equate to almost 50%, 50, of our current domestic gas production. This is staggering, with fairly obvious serious implications for domestic prices, supplies. Next slide, please. But don't take my word for it. The Department of Energy itself found in December, and Shelley referenced the study a bit as well, wherein it finally finalized this long-awaited study on LNG exports. And despite DOE making some pretty generous assumptions, including on the commercial scalability, viability, and availability of carbon capture and sequestration, the study confirms what frontline communities, consumer advocates, U.S. manufacturers, and even industrial consumers have been saying to federal regulators for quite some time now, namely that increased LNG exports will raise domestic natural gas and electricity prices. And these heightened costs will be felt most acutely by consumers and by more energy-intensive industries. And the study also debunks this displacement myth, and it shows that increased U.S. LNG export do not simply replace dirtier fuels abroad. That is a myth. I want to say that again. They lead to more overall global gas consumptions, thus higher GHG emissions, more climate change. So to say it just slightly differently, via the Department of Energy's own secretarial statement, they emphasized a triple cost increase for households, rising costs of natural gas as a commodity, higher electricity prices, and inflated manufacturing costs passed to consumers. And of course, we see these impacts most vividly in places like Southwest Louisiana, Cameron Parish, for example, where repeated LNG expansions approved one after the other, literally a stone's throw away, cause continuous flaring, air quality violations, and real and significant harm to local people, industries, including local fisheries. And so here, pictured, you'll see my client Tad, and he's a member of a multi-generational fishing community in Cameron Parish, Louisiana, which, by the way, used to be one of the top fisheries in the United States, which has changed a lot since LNG came to town, as his shrimp catch has declined by upwards of 50%. And in this photo, Tad is, anybody that's a shrimper on this call, I don't know if there's any shrimpers on the call, but shows Tad dropping the bag, which happens when a net has so few shrimp that it's not even worth sorting through. And instead it's thrown straight back into the water. And that's been happening more and more. So you might wonder, given all of this, might FERC and DOE finally tap the brakes? I'm smiling because I think we all know the answer here. We have a historical bipartisan rubber stamping of these projects, and both Republican and Democratic administrations up until very recently had a very hands-off approach. And under the current administration, I don't think it's any secret, they've made it clear that they are going to take aggressive steps to streamline even more fossil fuel approvals, including LNG exports. And already multiple new export terminals, pipelines, gas expansion projects, as Shelley highlighted, are in the queue. Next slide, please. So what does this mean for us and what should we do? Just a few ideas to throw out here. We need to demand a clear standard from our federal regulators, as Commissioner Clements rightly called for. We need clarification on how FERC applies the public interest standard for LNG facilities. And in the absence of congressional action, which I think, we could be surprised, but I think is a fair assumption right now, FERC itself should develop a coherent policy that weighs economic benefits versus harms, climate impacts, socioeconomic harm, and public necessity. We also need to push the Department of Energy to adopt formally, moving forward, its finalized study and create and update its analysis. Comment period is open till March 20th. If anybody has the time and the capacity to weigh in on that docket, I recommend that you do. Given what we're facing, we really need to keep the pressure on and support third-party advocacy as well, reporting and monitoring of these projects and DOE actions. The reality is we need them to issue a robust public interest analysis that fully incorporates domestic impacts. But absent that, we need to continue to hold regulators accountable. And many of FERC's decisions have disregarded states' objections, and advocates must keep challenging these approvals through litigation and public pressure. And lastly, I think it goes without saying, but we need to continue to champion clean energy infrastructure while gas projects more or less continue to sail through the regulatory projects approval process. Critical transmission lines, renewable generation, storage, they face far more stringent permitting. We need to streamline modern clean energy projects, which is a different but related conversation to this, because we need to ensure that we're not locking ourselves into this fossil fuel future, all at the expense of a reliable, affordable, and low carbon grid. Well, with that, thank you for your time, and I look forward to continuing the discussion on how we can advocate for a more balanced, forward-thinking energy policy that genuinely serves the public interest.
Great. Thank you, Megan and Shelley. All right, we have a number of questions coming in. I can tell there's a lot of interest in this topic, so I really appreciate y'all's work on this, your research into it, and presenting it in this way to us today. I am going to start off. I'm going to moderate our Q&A with questions to both Shelley and Megan, or both. You can still put in additional questions. We have about 20 minutes left in the webinar, so please put in additional questions. If you have them, put them in the Q&A box down at the bottom of your screen. So I want to start just with one clarifying question for you, Shelley, to get that one out of the way. Can you restate again what you meant by that 1/6 of CO2 emissions? Can you restate that for folks that may have missed?
Yeah, it is. I use the EPA's carbon emissions calculator, so it's their kind of standardized calculator to come up with the figure, and then compared. It is that is 1/6 of the 2022 gas fleet. So like could be confusing when I talked about Duke, I talked about their gas and fossil or gas and coal fleet, their fossil fleet. But in this instance, it is just the US gas fleet.
Okay, so the entire
compared.
US gas fleet. Thank you.
Mhm.
All right. And another one for you, Shelley, but of course, welcome Megan to weigh in as well. How have state regulators engaged in the question of are ratepayers being asked to pay for 20 plus years for assets whose value will not be realized to ratepayers beyond a brief moment of maximum capacity utilization? Has this been the subject of controversy in the paper docket or in testimony and commentary during state proceedings, including the ones that we've been involved in at the North Carolina Utilities Commission?
Short answer, no. They have not. They do the issue that has come up in proceedings is has to do with the gas fleet itself. Where are we going to build a gas plant if it's not going to run for if it's going to be down to a small capacity factor in just a few years, but no one is talking about the pipelines themselves and the whole issue of what they're paying, what the utilities are signing contracts to pay for firm transportation. They have to pay that. That is an amount they pay every month, regardless of how much they use, and typically 20-year length. So there has been almost no discussion of that. The discussion is centered around, do you have firm transportation for the CCs? Yes? Okay, move on. So that's been pretty much it, unless there's been confidential testimony that I've not been party to. So that is part of why we're doing what we're doing here, is to elevate this issue and get more conversation around this and more understanding.
And just to kind of reiterate, repeat, because I think it's worth repeating, the chart that Shelley shared that showed that these gas plants that Duke is proposing in its carbon plan are not going to be utilized very long. That was in testimony that we filed in the carbon plan docket. So it's not that the Utilities Commission didn't see this argument, because we were there making it. Anything you want to add on that, Megan? Or
No, I think you covered it.
okay. All right. The next one is for you, Megan. Are there possibilities or proposals, or would it be possible for a proposal at the state level to set public interest determinations that could impact FERC or DOE determinations of what is in the public interest?
Absolutely. And there's a number of different ways one potentially could get at that, including by helping to educate your state elected officials at the local and the state level, so even at the county level, on impacts of these massive gas capacity increase infrastructure that's being proposed through our region on ratepayers, everyday consumers, as well as domestic manufacturing. And one thing I should highlight, and this is shocking even to state regulators, these pipes at the federal level, they are guaranteed a 14% return on equity. So talk about a perverse incentive structure to build stuff that, quite frankly, we don't need and is harmful at the end of the day. So education, advocacy campaigns, connecting with your AG's office, really anyone within the state to talk about these issues. Aside from impacts on ratepayers, which I think everyone universally understands and is a bipartisan issue, clean air, clean water, these are things that also arguably are bipartisan. An emphasis on that at the state level. The state does have a decision-making points rather, I should say, in these projects, namely on potentially on water crossings and on certifications under the Clean Water Act. So that's another area where it's worthwhile talking with your policymakers. And I'm happy to talk more about that offline.
Can't hear you, Maggie.
Of course. All right. Another one for Shelley. Is there a way to estimate that if state commissioners or commissions were able to right size ratepayer support of pipeline build out or capacity to some reasonable level of deliverability to meet the generation demand, that they could determine, a certain amount of money for building pipelines would no longer be available from the ratepayers, and then, who would bear that cost, who would have to fill that gap.
The commission certainly can do this. They can determine how much of what percentage of these firm transportation contracts the ratepayers are going to be on the hook for. But as far as us being able to predict right now, like a particular dollar amount, we don't have enough visibility into the contracts. But hopefully this is an area that will continue to increase in attention, and there will be more attention paid to this issue in the dockets. Maybe our public advocates, our public staffs will start to look into this issue a lot more and advocate on behalf of the ratepayers that they shouldn't be paying for unnecessary pipeline infrastructure that is not going to be fully utilized and used and useful, as they say. But diving more into the actual numbers, that is sort of a next step. So we're just at the beginning of all of this daylighting, I hope.
Great, thanks. All right. Next is a little bit of a different kind of question, but I'm excited and I can help answer this too, I hope. Someone says they are with a group called Third Act in Georgia and wants to know what they can do to support the efforts of clean energy transition and LNG pipelines flowing through their state, particularly the Elba Island LNG shipping terminal. They're already fighting the data center tsunami, their words, and working in the 2025 Georgia legislative session. Anything else you would recommend? I will take moderator privilege to first say that also take a look at what's going on at the Georgia Public Service Commission, because there is an integrated resource plan, IRP, in which Georgia Power is proposing new gas power plants. And then that runs January through July of this year. And then after that, there will be a Georgia Power rate case at the commission, as well as elections for 2 of the 5 commissioners in November of this year. So there's also a lot going on at the commission in Georgia this year. Anything, either Megan or Shelley, that you guys want to add for how folks can get involved in Georgia or other states, just sort of generally?
Yeah, I mean, most certainly paying attention to what's happening before the PUC right now, as well as the upcoming rate case. The and connecting the dots between the forecasted load and the data centers that may or may not appear and interconnect to the grid in Georgia. That's an open question as to the true amount of energy that's needed and the durability of those contracts. As well as I'm not sure that consumers and the public generally understand that connection, that part of this larger puzzle is all of these data centers coming in, making proposals in various states, sometimes redundant proposals to see where they can interconnect the fastest and the cheapest. So it may or may not appear. And that serving as justification for increased gas capacity build out, including generation and pipes. And so connecting those dots more and more, even developing a better understanding with the public, I think could go a long way.
And I'll just add, it's important to remember that essentially these costs, firm transportation, it's pretty much, it's very easy for the utilities to, sign up for this amount of firm transportation. They have almost no skin in the game right now if all of it is passed through to ratepayers. So whether that's residential, whether that's commercial and industrial. So if it's all passed through, they don't have any reason not to do it unless and until the regulators say, no, you're not going to get, you can't pass all of this through. You're only going to be able to pass this little amount through. And if that starts to become the standard, then, maybe we'll start to see them back off of how much firm transportation they actually sign up for, if they're actually taking on some risk themselves in that case.
And Maggie, can I jump in here real quick? One of the things that, as we've been talking about with the digital demand, particularly the AI companies and the data centers for cloud services, many of these are very large tech companies that had set climate goals, but they're actually now rolling back or pushing those climate goals off. And I think as consumers and as informed citizens, we need to hold those tech companies to their promise that they're going to actually pursue clean energy technologies and not default back to fossil gas in the near term. And I think that is a consumer advocacy piece that people throughout our region, as these data centers and some of these big tech companies are expanding, we need to hold them accountable to their targets and not let them slip those targets or ignore them.
Thanks for that, Steve. All right, I think we have time for a couple of more. And I'm not sure that we're going to get to all the questions, but if we missed yours, feel free to follow up with us afterwards as well, if you would like to talk further. Moving from sort of the state and local to more of a global view, can you guys talk a little bit about some of the market forces driving LNG projects, what countries on the global sphere are driving demand? And then we also have a question about which companies are the most active selling gas overseas. Is that something we can cover here, or should we kick that to a follow-up?
I can talk to the former, kind of what's driving it. And there's a number of things, of course, Russia, cutting off, gas supply being limited to Europe. That's part of it. Decarbonization in the form of switching, like in China and other countries, switching from coal to gas is driving it, just like it is here. And then there's also just general growth that is driving it as well. So there are a number of factors. It sort of depends on where you are in the world and what's going on. But Europe is a big one. And then China is big. And the US is not the only player, of course. Qatar is a major player and several others, Australia. But we are considered very reliable, partly because we are a stable country, but also because of the massive pipeline infrastructure that we already have that supplies LNG out. So what we're seeing in other countries is a pipeline structure that brings LNG in. So they'll have their import ports, and then they're building pipelines to get the regasified LNG into the country.
Yeah, agreed with all of that, Shelley. And I'll just add, the geopolitical concerns are obviously quite complex, but the LNG industry has propagated a narrative that increased US LNG exports will bolster our national security by providing gas to strategic allies. And I think the data honors that. And we don't have to speculate where the gas is going. Like this data is all available online on EIA as well as other credible sources. But European parliamentarian members themselves have fought back against that narrative in our dockets. For example, in the CP2 LNG export facility docket that was pending before FERC, a letter was filed by European parliamentarians politely asking that we not adopt this narrative, that they consider it to be false. And German parliamentarians separately filed in the same docket, noting that everything that's being built and said contradicts Germany's climate targets and its aim of phasing out fossil fuels as quickly as possible. And that's Europe. And in Asia, South Korea and Japan have really been anchors in that region for where the gas is going, but demand is declining because they are modernizing and transitioning their grid.
Thank you. All right, I think we have time for one more. I'm going to try and fit it in quickly before we go. We mentioned earlier that the electric utilities that are planning these gas plants that are, the basis for building out the system, the pipeline companies are using as the basis for building out the system. The electric utilities themselves don't have any skin in the game as far as the cost of gas goes. Just as a little aside, because a lot of folks are not aware of this, electric utilities pass their fuel costs on directly to customers. So they're not earning a return on that, but they're also not impacted if prices go higher than they expected. And so that's what we mean by they don't have any skin in the game. So what, if any, proposals or existing structures exist to force utilities to put more skin in the game or restrict ratepayer pass-through? Are there any good examples out there? I know we've been working on what we call fuel cost sharing. And Shelley, if you want me to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I was going to punt that one to you for that.
Yeah, okay. That's actually a me question. All right, I'll go ahead and answer just briefly, which is particularly in South Carolina and Georgia, we've been active in proposing that electric utilities do share in some of the risk, not of gas prices, being high or low, just on the face of it, but on the risk of their own forecasts of gas prices being wrong. So we're going to try and force, or our idea is to try and force electric utilities to do a better job of forecasting gas prices when they are building out these portfolios, because that is a first step to what I think would be a, sort of right sizing of these proposals, to use a term that was brought up earlier. And it depends state to state on whether or not that can be done strictly through a commission and regulatory means, or if that requires state level legislation. There are a few states that are going that route, including Hawaii and a few others that escape my memory at this point, but we can follow up. And now I've talked us past our time. I'm gonna see if you guys have any final comments that you want to leave the viewers with. And I just want to say again, thank you, Shelley and Megan, for giving us all this really valuable information today.
Thanks, Maggie. I just appreciate the attention folks are paying by being on this webinar, being paid to this issue. Pipelines have flown, they're out of sight, out of mind. They've flown under the radar for a long time, but they are beginning to really pile up and cost us a fortune, pile up literally side by side in the ground. And the need, this is happening at a time when we have the ability and have the technology to decarbonize and to not need this additional fossil infrastructure, and to leave it in the ground, essentially, to find other ways. So it's just, as Steve kind of set it up at the very beginning, we've got this incredible opportunity, but we also have all of these threats at the same time. And we are here to help help answer that call, to kind of poke into the to pull back the curtain and see what's really going on, to try to daylight these issues, because I think transparency will get us much better outcome everywhere.
All right, thank you all. Take care.